In 1988, what seems like 200 years ago, I had the opportunity to work with what was then the Liberty Road Church in Lexington, Kentucky for a summer. They're now the East Side, I think is the name of that congregation. As they moved further east from town, they stayed Liberty Road in their first move, and then they built another building since then, and it's on the east side of town, I assume, because they call themselves East Side now, so I assume that's why that is. But at any rate, while I was there, I shared an apartment with some folks. I was preaching for that summer with the Liberty Road group. And I can remember that the first trip I made from the apartment I was living in to the building, that I was fine getting from the apartment to the building, but there were some one-way streets that had to be involved. And on my way back, it wasn't quite as simple. I ended up on the wrong road, and I thought to myself, well, at least I get to see Rupp Arena. I drove by where Kentucky basketball is played. At least I got to see Rupp Arena. I saw Rupp Arena 15 times over the next 10 minutes, trying to figure out where I was. Now keep in mind, this is before cell phones, before Yahoo Maps, before GPS was offered to people, before anything. I would have paid good money for any of those things because I was tired of seeing Rupp Arena. I'd seen it enough. I was totally lost. And it took me probably a half hour, 45 minutes maybe, of continuing loops to finally realize what street I needed to hit to get out of this problem. I was lost. Disconnected from the path that I needed to be on. And it was hard. Sometimes we disconnect ourselves from the path that we need to be on. In the text that Aaron just read for us, he reminds us through that psalm that there is a challenge that comes to us when we choose to disconnect from our Creator. When we choose to be misled, when we choose to be misguided, when we choose to walk a path that separates ourselves from God, we choose a path of destruction and challenge. And we harm ourselves through that process. And just as I would have paid good money and would have been willing to accept any and all offers of information to get me off that path that kept me in a continual loop around Rupp Arena, we too maybe should stop and consider what kinds of things are taking me away from God to begin with. What is it that's causing this difficulty for me? What is it that seems to keep me on this continual loop that never really gets back on the path that God would desire for me? And let me share with you this morning just 3 things that I believe can cause that for us as we strive to walk with God. And the first one is we get distracted. You know, I've lived in this town 100 years, it seems like, but there are still times where I get to talking to Deborah, where I get into some conversation, and I will drive right past Church Street and have to loop back around to go home because I was distracted. Because I was in conversation. There are times that I'm driving up to Mom's house and I'll end up in Sistersville because I forgot where I was going. Because I was distracted by something. My mind on something else. Now you might say you may not want to drive anywhere near me if that's kind of the way. It doesn't happen that often. But distraction. We even talk about that, don't we? We talk nowadays about distracted drivers because there are so much gadgetry and information at people's hands that we have distractions all around us. And we have distractions sometimes that challenge us in our relationship with God. May I offer just a thought for you to consider without getting upset with me this morning? We're too busy. We are absolutely too busy. We are so busy that we are so easily distracted from things that are important and vital in our lives. We are so wrapped up sometimes in being busy. In fact, I don't know of anybody who would not define themselves probably as busy. Everyone you talk to anymore is always busy. And I'm not saying that there aren't some things that keep us busy that are important. I'm not implying somehow that nothing is important. But the fact of the matter is we probably are all occupying too much time with busy things rather than important things. In Luke chapter 12, verse 20, notice Jesus says, "But God said to him, 'Fool, this night your soul will be required of you. Then whose will those things be which you have provided? So is he who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. May I suggest to you that all of us at times are too busy laying up riches to ourselves. We're busy because we're doing the things that I want to do, the things that I enjoy, the things that promote the betterment of my life, the things that I'm interested in. We devote ourselves and so much attention to those things that we are distracted from what's important. I fear, and I'm legitimately saying this, I fear that I might someday have to stand before my God and He looks Brian in the eyes and says, "Thou fool, you were too busy. You were too busy with too many things that were not important, that were just simply distractions from the work that God would desire for us to be involved in. You laid up a lot of treasures. You had a lot of enjoyments. You had a lot of good things in your walk in human life. But I wasn't a big enough priority to you. For some reason, you were distracted from your relationship with me." In 1 Kings chapter 20. Back up one verse into verse 39 of 1 Kings chapter 20. "Now as the king passed by, he cried out to the king and said, 'Your servant went out into the midst of the battle. And there a man came over and brought a man to me and said, Guard this man. If by any means he is missing, your life shall be for his life, or else you shall pay a talent of silver. And while your servant was busy here and there, he was gone. Then the king of Israel said to him, So shall your judgment be. You yourself have decided it.'" What do you think about the sobering phrase that is? You yourself have decided it. What was the responsibility in verse 39? The responsibility was that guy is your prisoner and you make sure he doesn't go anywhere. And you make sure, in fact, I'm telling you that your life is on the line if this guy gets away. If he is released or if he escapes or if he gets out of your sight, you are accountable for this thing. And notice what he said. He's gone because I was busy here and there. Because I was busy with lesser important things, the main objective and the main accountability you required of me, I have slipped. My point, friends, from this text is that I again fear that someday we may stand before God and He will say to us, So shall your judgment be. You yourself have decided it. You decided to be busy here and there and ignoring what I desired from you. You decided to be distracted from your relationship with me. You chose to be so busy that you had no time whatsoever to serve your God. You yourself have decided it. You know, I think sometimes we maybe have this imagery that God is the one in some ways that's going to make this decision about our eternal state. But friends, I believe the Bible illustrates to us that judgment, that decision, that choice was not necessarily made by Jehovah. That choice and decision was made by me before I ever stand before God in judgment. Before I ever stand before Him, it is me. You yourself have decided it, Brian. Choose wisely. And don't be so busy here and there that we forget what's really important. Where are our treasures? Where are we laying up treasures? Are we focused upon eternal things? Are we overwhelmed and consumed with life here on earth? Because Jesus said in Matthew 6:21, For where your heart, or where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. We live very distracted lives. We're easily pulled away from things that are important. We're easily persuaded that what really are trivial matters are of such great importance that here are weightier matters of life that we set aside and do not consider as well as we should. And we're easily distracted from our God. And so in the process, we're going to have to learn some priorities. We're going to have to stop and think for a minute. what's really important here? I did some tech work when I was in Marshall County. When we lived up there, they would send me into schools, and they would send me in with a list. They'd print me out a list, or I'd print out a list of the work that they wanted me to do when I walked in that building. But the problem was you couldn't walk in the building without 15 people coming to you with 15 other problems that aren't on your list. And it was hard to convince folks when they're looking you in the eye saying, I want you to go do this, and for me to have to say that if I get these done, then I'll come see you. Because they thought their problem was the priority of the day. Their tech issue was what I ought to be spending my time on, and it was hard to convince them that if you want to get on the list, you've got to submit the problem. And then let us prioritize those so we can do them in order. Because some things were of lesser importance than others, and we had to prioritize that work order. And if you've worked in any kind of industry or circumstances like that, you know what I'm talking about. There's lots of things to be done, but there's a certain order they're going to have to be done in. There's a certain priority. Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 3. So He humbled you, allowed you to hunger, and fed you with manna which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that He might make you know that man shall not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that proceeds from the mouth of the Lord. That's what Jesus reiterated, if you remember, in Matthew chapter 4, when He's dealing with Satan, and Satan says, turn stone into bread, and He quotes this thought. Man does not live by bread alone. Man must prioritize spiritual over physical every single time. Spiritual things must always be the priority over the physical. And I don't know that we've really let that set into our mindset as much as we should. We have convinced ourselves that there are certain physical things that are the utmost importance in all things. Food, shelter, clothing, right? Those three first, and then whatever we can do after that's all well and good. But notice what He said. He said, I fed you with this manna, so that you might learn that I'm what's really important. That you don't live by just the food that you consume and the physical things that you need, but you live by the message and teachings that come from Jehovah. We're distracted because we don't have the right priority. Let me give you food for thought. Maybe I need to... Are you a list writer? Do you like to make lists? Do you go to the grocery store with a list? Deborah even has the list printed out so that she kind of has it categorized, and she can pull off a slip off the refrigerator and she can write in each category. And you know why she does that? Because sometimes she's got to give me the list, and she actually puts it in the order of the store when you loop around, because she knows I get lost. Organized, right? You've got lists. Why? So that you don't forget. Maybe sit down and make a list of what's important to you. Maybe it'd be a good exercise for all of us just to sit down, get a piece of paper and a pen, and start writing your priorities and see what they are and where they fit. And then evaluate reality and ask yourself, here's what they look like on paper. Here's what my priorities look like when I wrote them down. But then look at your actual daily living and see if they're in the same order. See whether your daily living actually matches what you believe it should be when you write it down on paper. And then work on it. Learn the concept of priority and importance so that we're not distracted away from Jesus. Because, friends, there are differences between things that are urgent and things that are important. And maybe one of the greatest challenges we have is trying to understand the difference between those two things. Something may be important, but it may not be urgent in the moment. Some things may have a certain level of need, but they're not the urgent matter that needs to be addressed at hand. You remember the account of Mary and Martha here in Luke chapter 10, right? Now, let me ask you before you reread these verses that I know you're familiar with, is it wrong to feed your guests when they come into your house? Is it wrong to provide a meal? Is it wrong to want to have a neat and tidy home before they ever walk into that place? Is it wrong to want to treat your guests with comforts and treat them as the company and guests that you would want them to be? None of those things are wrong. In fact, there may be even a level of argument you could make that it's important to want to be hospitable and kind. But I want you to notice the specific language we're talking about this morning. But Martha was distracted with much serving. And she approached Him and said, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Therefore tell her to help me. And Jesus answered and said to her, Martha, Martha, you are worried and troubled about many things. But one thing is needed. One thing is urgent in the moment, Martha. And Mary has chosen it. Mary has chosen that good part which will not be taken away from her. I don't know how to say what I'm about to say very well, so I'm just going to say it as best I can. Do not neglect your own personal relationship with Christ because I'm overwhelmed with serving tables. And I hope you'll understand what I mean by that. I mean it in the context of what's happening with Martha here. Martha is doing something that's good, right? She's caring for people. She's taking care of guests in her home. She's doing something that is right and good within itself. But she is so distracted by it. She is so focused on it that she has forgotten that Jesus is the guest. And if I have my choice between making sure He's got the best meal I could ever fix or sitting down and listening to what He has to say, I'll choose listening to what He has to say. If I have to choose between offering a sandwich and getting to hear Him and offering a 37-course meal and ignoring Him, I'll choose the sandwich and listening. Don't become so overwhelmed with serving that we neglect our personal connection to the vine that we've been studying about in our Bible study. Serving others is great. It's how we show our love. It's the way we exemplify our love. It's the way the world sees Jesus in us as we love one another and care for one another. But I cannot be so overwhelmed with service that I forget there's a Savior that wants to be listened to and learned from. It's a hard balance sometimes. But don't be so distracted by the busy things of life that you forget your personal relationship and connection to Jesus. Lest you thought I'd never get to number 2. Here's our second thought. Delusion. Sometimes we're persuaded away from God because we're deluded. We're delusional. We're not thinking clearly. We're not thinking accurately in relationship to certain things. We convince ourselves. Back to this distracted thought, combine the two. We convince ourselves that other things are legitimately more important than God. There's probably some honesty here that all of us could exercise. We've already all probably been there at some point. Where it was not a matter of me saying, I don't want anything that God has to offer. I don't want any relationship with Him. What we did was we diluted our thinking to the point where we thought, no, I've got to get this done first. This has got to be, I'll figure out the God thing later. I'll figure out the relationship with Jesus later. And so we become delusional about what really needs to be done in what order. We can create a false sense of reality for ourselves. Go back into the book of Malachi for a moment. In Malachi chapter 1 and in verse 6, he says, "A son honors his father and a servant his master. If then I am the father, where is my honor? If I am the master, where is my reverence, says the Lord of hosts? To you priests who despise my name, yet you say, in what way have we despised your name?" And then he begins the list. You've offered defiled food upon my altar. But you say, when did I do that? You call the table of the Lord contemptible. You say, when did we do? They're delusional. They're guilty of all kinds of things that have disconnected themselves from God, and they're denying it all the way. Can I just ask you again a simple question this morning, or maybe not so simple in terms of the reality of the answer. But can I ask you to consider for a moment, how many times have you lied to yourself? You know, I'd like to believe that I've done my best in life to not lie to others, to not tell somebody else some falsehood, to not perpetrate something that is a lie to other people. I would hope that I've been successful with that. But you know what? I don't know that I've always been so successful about not lying to myself. Not lying to myself about my genuine spiritual condition. Not lying to myself about what's really important or not. Not lying to myself about what I really need to be focused on. They had a completely, in Malachi's day, had a completely false sense of reality. You polluted my altar. When did I do that? They said. You treated the Lord's table as contemptible. When? You brought the blind and the lame and the sick as your offering. When did we do that? And they probably had just done it. We become very delusional sometimes in our relationship with God, and honesty is the only thing that will clarify it. We've exchanged the permanent for the temporary. We do it all the time. We've got a greater impulse and desire to make sure our physical life is comfortable. And if I can happen to figure out my spiritual path in the meantime, then that's all well and good too. In verse 16 of Hebrews 12, lest there be any fornicator or profane person like Esau, who for one morsel of food sold his birthright. For you know that afterward, when he wanted to inherit the blessing, he was rejected, for he found no place for repentance, though he sought it diligently with tears. He couldn't reverse it. I'm concerned that maybe we have focused on the temporary, we have so focused on the earthly, that we don't even know the path, if you will, to get us to be able to reverse that trend. We have lied and lied and lied to ourselves for so long about what really is important and where the priorities should rest and what I'm really doing in my life that it's going to be hard sometimes to fix the path. The Hebrew writer in Hebrews chapter 11 talked about how folks become so enamored with the pleasures of sin, the earthly, worldly things, that they've forgotten it's sin. We've become delusional about sin. We have been calling evil good for quite a while now. And we have to be careful. Our souls are at stake. And we've so convinced ourselves that what I want right now is all that I really need. If I can just have everything I want right now, then everything will be good and well. And friends, it's simply not true. And so we've become distracted. We've become delusional, lying to ourselves, not being honest about our spiritual realities, all the while disconnecting ourselves from God, and finally, we're living in denial. You've heard me use the phrase, denial ain't just a river in Egypt, right? Denial is a real problem for all of us, because we choose sometimes not to see the realities of our circumstance. We convince ourselves that if I can deny it today, if I can deny the realities of my circumstance today, that maybe somehow it'll fix itself by tomorrow. And the problem is that I deny realities today, which actually, in all honesty, all that does is make it easier to deny the realities tomorrow, deny them the next day, and deny them the next day. And what the result of all that is that I end up living a life that's not even true. Because I've lived in denial for so long. We choose not to see the need for God. That was Psalm 10, partly as Aaron read a little while ago, and it's also part of Proverb 30. Proverb 30 and verse 12. There is a generation, Proverbs say, there is a generation that is pure in its own eyes, yet is not washed from its filthiness. when you think about it, there's basically, in some senses, in relationship to this verse especially, there are two choices that we can make. The first choice is, I can recognize what's sinful and evil in my life and go to the blood of the Lamb and wash it away. That's choice number one, and the best choice, right? I can admit, not deny, not lie about it, not live in delusion, not be distracted, just pure honesty. This conduct in my life is sinful and evil, and it needs to be washed in the blood of the Lamb. Or, as the proverb says, I can just decide that evil is actually pure and just stay in that state or condition. I've got to make a decision about whether I'll deny the realities of sin and their consequences in my life, or I'll go and have them washed in the blood of the Lamb. I've got to make a conscious choice to not quit denying what they're doing to me. And I think what we do sometimes is we're not honest about what sin's really doing to me. We're not honest about the distractions it's bringing to my life. We're not honest about the harm that it's bringing to my relationships. We're not honest about what it's doing to my service for God. We're not honest about what sin is really doing. We're just caught up and it seems good and it's fun, it's pleasurable, and it does all the things I want it to do. And we get all wrapped up in that and we lie to ourselves about the harm it's actually causing. And we choose not to see a need for God or any change or any correction in my life. Let's go into that text that Aaron read. Let's look at it together for a few moments. In Psalm 10. And verse 4. The wicked in his proud countenance does not seek God. God is none of his thoughts. I had a conversation one time with a fellow about some certain behaviors. And here's what amazed me the most about that conversation was something he said. He basically said, Brian, I would do the exact same thing if Jesus was standing right here with us. He had so determined in his mind that the sinful practice that he was involved in had no consequence and no reason for him to be concerned, that he was so bold as to say, so proud as to say, if Jesus Himself was standing right here, I'd do it anyway. God was none of his thoughts. The wicked in his proud countenance does not seek God. God is none of his thoughts. His ways are always prospering. Your judgments are far above, out of his sight. As for all his enemies, he sneers at them. Everything always works according to him. Everything works out for him. It's all good. None of your concerns over him. He just sneers at any thoughts you might bring to him. He has said in his heart, I shall not be moved. I shall never be in adversity. I don't need God because I always prosper. I'm always smarter than the next guy. I'm always better off than he is. Why should I move? And that's what pride will do to anyone. That's what denial of reality will do to anyone. The psalmist had spoken not just about his own generation, but about every generation of mankind, where men have become so proud and so confident and so determined in their paths and choices and ways in life that they have no need for God whatsoever. They deny the very necessity of a relationship with our Creator. There's lots of reasons why we might be persuaded away from God. There may be lots of reasons why we're distracted, away, disconnected in the path that's leading us away from God. Maybe we've been overly distracted by this life. Maybe we're just living a lie. We're telling ourselves all is well, all is well, all is well, when it's not. We're delusional. Or maybe we're just living in denial as if we don't really need God anyway. I got a pretty good life. Things are going well. Got good health. Got a nice family. 2 cars, a truck, and a boat, and a nice house to live in. Plenty of vacation time. Life is good. Without ever a thought, number one, that those things could be taken away in a blink of an eye. But number two, how much better those things would be if we would just honor God with them and appreciate the blessings of how those things have come from the hands of God, rather than disconnecting ourselves from Him as if all is well and everything's perfect and I am in need of nothing. Because I don't care how prosperous we become and how well off we are here on this earth, we'll never be in a circumstance where we don't need God. We can lie to ourselves about that, but it won't be true. We will always be in need of our Creator, no matter how prosperous and how good and how blessed life may be. So can I encourage you this morning to think about your relationship with God? Can I encourage you this morning to soberly consider whether you're in harmony with God? Have you been rejecting Him, turning Him aside? Have you been distracted, deluded, denied that you even need your Creator? And can we help you correct that this morning? Can we help you be washed in the blood of the Lamb through baptism to know the cleansing of your sins? Can we help you step back into the right path that God has for all of us? If we could strengthen you spiritually in some way today, if we could strengthen you to reconnect to your Creator or connect to Him anew, then we invite you to consider that soberly. Won't you come while we stand and while we sing?